When it comes to geopolitics, there's a lot of discussion about Ukraine, Gaza, and of course, Taiwan. These are, in many ways, front lines of different kinds of major conflicts. But what is often forgotten is the role of the countries who are just behind the front line. And there's one country in particular which has rapidly emerged as a major force in European and international politics, and that is Poland. Throughout its history, Poland suffered many kinds of geopolitical setbacks. On 3 occasions, Poland, as a nation, disappeared from the map of the earth. Devoured by competing empires in Europe, the Polish people began to build their own national identity and fight for their own country successfully in recent centuries. The 20th century was a particularly painful one for Poland. After suffering invasion by Nazi Germany, it was effectively occupied by the Soviet Union after the Second World War. Until the twilight years of the 20th century, Poland was effectively a Russian colony. But since joining the European Union, Poland has been a success story, one of the most dynamic economies on earth. Per capita income has effectively exploded, making Poland even wealthier than Portugal. Not to mention the rise of Poland as a major military force. Poland has established a world-class industrial complex, which has allowed it to export increasingly sophisticated, including Black Hawk helicopters, defense equipment to countries like the Philippines. And amid rising tensions between NATO and Europe on one hand and Russia on the other, Poland has emerged as a pivotal state. And with Poland becoming richer, more powerful, and more influential not only in the Ukraine conflict, but in the world stage, it has become more influential also in Asia, or at least that's what it hopes to achieve. Accordingly, Poland recently sent a high-level delegation to this part of the world, and no less than the rockstar diplomat, Foreign Minister Sikorski, visited the Philippines and the broader ASEAN region. In order to understand Poland's strategic culture, its growing influence on the international stage, and growing middle power to middle power relationship between Poland and the Philippines, and of course, how to double down on security and strategic cooperation between the two countries, we're going to talk to our special guest.
Minister, thank you very much for joining us. I know you got a lot to do, so let's try to cover as much as we can with the limited time available to us. First of all, let's talk about Ukraine. What are the facts of the case? What are the myths out there? What are the disinformation out there, especially by our Russian friends, that you want to correct to the Asian audience? Because I think here in this part of the world, there's a lot of unfortunate receptiveness to alternative narratives, or some would say Russian-backed disinformation. What are the facts of the case?
Well, the hardest of hard facts of the case is that it's Russia invaded Ukraine and not the other way around. That it's Russia that wants to control Ukraine, which it used to control in the 19th century and in the 20th century. That it is Europe's last colonial war. That Vladimir Putin is trying to rebuild the Russian and Soviet Empire, and he wants Ukraine to be again part of it. And Ukraine says, no, actually, we didn't enjoy it. Last time we were a colony, we want to determine our own future, we want to be a democracy, we want to join the European Union, and we don't need another country telling us what we may or may not do.
So what is this whole thing about narrative about, oh, this is because of NATO expansion, that Ukraine provoked Russia, that Russia's core strategic interests were undermined by Ukraine? So in short, Ukraine brought it upon itself.
When Russia took over Crimea, Ukraine was constitutionally a neutral country. I was at the NATO summit in 2008 when Ukraine asked for a membership action plan. Ukraine didn't get it, and there was no movement whatsoever towards membership. The truth is that Ukraine started thinking about alliances only when Russia started threatening it.
And the Georgia case also, of course.
That was a little later, but remember, Ukraine gave up the world's third largest nuclear stockpile in 1993 in return for Russian guarantees of its independence and borders. Russia and Ukraine have a border treaty which is physically delineated on the ground. That border treaty was negotiated, signed, and ratified by President Vladimir Putin. He is breaking a treaty that he himself signed.
So if it's not provocation or NATO expansion, what is the true reason? What is the read from Poland, from Warsaw? Why did Putin do this?
Well, do you remember the rebellion by Mr. Prigozhin, the head of the mercenary group Wagner? He became disillusioned, and he said this war was launched so that Russian oligarchs could become richer, so that they can plunder Ukrainian resources and steal Ukrainian companies. Classic colonial behavior. The Soviet Union disintegrated because its constituent parts wanted to go their own way. Ukraine has the right to go its own way. And Russia claims that there were issues to do with national minorities. Well, that's how the Second World War was started by Nazi Germany, also on similar pretexts. We now have a taboo in Europe on using this as a pretext. If you have a problem with your minority on the other side of an international border, you take it to the Council of Europe, you take it to the UN. You do not send tanks. This is not allowable.
And what about the aspect of the ideological aspect, the Maidan Square revolution, the thriving of democratic and liberal values in Ukraine, the more westward kind of tinge in discussions in Ukraine? Was it an ideological threat to a kind of an aging and increasingly, perhaps some would even say, unpopular?
I think there is something to it. It's true that Ukrainians and Russians are quite close. And by the way, just because you speak Russian doesn't mean that you are a Russian, you know.
Right. They're saying, well, you don't speak Chinese doesn't make you Chinese. Yeah, you can be Singaporean Chinese.
Try to tell an Irishman that he's English.
Right.
Or a Scot for that matter.
Good luck with that.
But it is true that the nations are quite close. And I think this is right, that Putin saw Ukrainian democracy and the fight against corruption as a threat to his own power base. I think he was also spooked by the Arab Spring and the sight of Gaddafi being hunted down and Mubarak in an iron cage being on trial. And he thought, I cannot permit this. This can happen to me.
And of course, you had people like Navalny also pushing the envelope, very dynamic opposition leaders that perhaps was also threatening Putin.
Yeah, I particularly enjoy when Russian diplomats denounce Ukraine as a corrupt country. Navalny, in his movies,
YouTube videos,
showed this ridiculous palace that was built for Putin, which I think proves how thoroughly corrupt Russia is.
Speaking of Poland, well, you're not at the very front line, but in many ways you have been at the front line for NATO in terms of absorption of the social shock, the folks coming down from Ukraine. What has been the
Russian missiles coming into our airspace? One of them landed 10 kilometers from my house. I assume that they lose control over them, but they are not less a threat for that. And, you know, Russia losing control over its drones and its cruise missiles in the airspace of a country, Ukraine, which has nuclear power plants, is not a laughing matter.
Yeah.
What if one of those drones that they lose control of hits the Zaporozhye or the Khmelnytsky nuclear power plant, and with the radiation? Putin is really playing with fire.
How is the evolution of the conflict so far from the Polish perspective? Because, of course, the first wave of Russian invasion didn't work very well. The counter maneuvers by Ukraine also didn't go very well. We're kind of in a dangerous stalemate, and Ukraine is also making its own offensive to Kursk area and all. What is Poland's read of this evolution of the...
Ukraine, without a navy, won the Battle of the Black Sea. Not only did it regain its ability to export grain and other foodstuffs from Odessa through the Bosphorus to international markets, but it actually forced the Russians to withdraw their navy from Sevastopol, the old naval base. And actually there are reports this morning of a Ukrainian sea drone hitting Russian targets in Novorossiya, which is Novorossiysk, the Russian naval base in eastern Black Sea. So here Ukraine won. In the air, the Russians can hit Ukraine with missiles and drones, but cannot operate freely. Their fighters and bombers cannot operate freely in the skies over Ukraine. So let's call it almost a draw. And on land, Putin is making advances of a few kilometers here and there at the cost of tens of thousands of soldiers in World War I style trench warfare.
Attrition warfare, really, yeah.
As far as I'm concerned, these are Pyrrhic victories. You know, there was a Greek general called Pyrrhus,
right,
who won all his battles with the Romans, but ended up without an army. And Putin has already sent over 500,000 young Russians to be killed and injured. On both sides, we think this war has already cost the lives and health of over 1 million people.
To what degree was the role of America very important in shaping the direction of conflict in terms of Ukraine's ability to defend itself? How important was the support from the United States?
Crucial. Early, or even before the full-scale invasion, the US warned Ukraine to be prepared. And then, if you remember, rather brilliantly used strategic intelligence to deny Russia a casus belli.
Right.
Russia, just like Nazi Germany and other imperialist powers, wanted to have a provocation, which they would have pinned on
False
the Ukrainians.
flag operation, yeah.
To say, well, we are acting in self-defense. And because Americans said this is coming, they were deprived of this pretext. And since then, the level of support from the European Union and from the United States is about the same, roughly 120 billion so far. But Europe's support is mostly budgetary, so that the Ukrainian state continues to function. And America's help is largely military and therefore even more crucial.
I know you're now a foreign minister, no longer a defense minister, so perhaps you'll be a little bit more delicate. But how important is the outcome of the elections in the United States in terms of also determining what happens in Europe and in Ukraine? Let's say Trump comes back.
Sure. I mean, we don't take sides, but we do follow events. So Kamala Harris, in her acceptance speech, stressed the importance of NATO and basically declared that she would continue the policy of the administration of which she is a part, which is unsurprising. I think US credibility is now tied to the outcome of this war. President Biden went to Kiev, planted the standard of the United States in downtown Kiev, and said that the US will be with Ukraine as long as it takes. Whereas I think it's a little different with President Trump. Some of his advisors say that Ukraine needs to make concessions. Others say we will end this war by threatening Putin with an escalation. You know, stop the aggression, or else we will increase military support to Ukraine. I like the second approach better.
Speaking of some of your fellow European countries, I mean, I was in Berlin earlier this year. We had a meeting with Chancellor Scholz. He seems to be, very much focused on the conflict in Ukraine. But I hear in Europe that many feel that countries like Germany are not stepping up to the plate. What is your understanding of that? With all the Zeitenwende conversation that was going on in Germany the other year.
In absolute numbers, Germany is actually the largest contributor. But of course, in proportion to GDP, it's otherwise. And so Germany, while doing a lot for Ukraine, had some hesitations early on, and that deprived it from of the credit for doing the right thing. But we need not only to help Ukraine, we also need to get serious about our own defense, because we don't know whether Putin would stop at Ukraine. So, and defense budgets have at last started rising. We should have done it years ago. Poland has, and we now need to spread the burden of deterring Putin more fairly across the continent. It can't be just on the flank states.
So burden sharing more
Well,
effective.
we are spending
more than 4%?
More than 4% of GDP.
Right.
But we have this European defense budget, which is assessed in proportion to GDP. And thank God we have it, because from it, we've been helping Ukraine. We need to, in my view, to multiply it and to have pan-European efforts to build more equipment, to produce more ammunition, to have more capability.
Speaking of Poland, obviously you have made huge strides over the past generation or so in terms of your economy. You're considered one of the most successful, if not the most successful in that part of the world. In terms of your military capabilities, we'll talk more about the Philippines shortly. Your defense industry is increasingly world-class and important. What is the Polish strategic culture, and how are you coping with the challenge from Russia? Or is this something that you were kind of prepared for and you feel this is the moment that, that perhaps you can live up to, stand up to? Yeah.
Our strategic culture is that we stand up for our independence, and we will not be dictated to. And Vladimir Putin had better take notice.
And and what about in terms of, because the sense I get when you go to certain parts of Europe is that there's a notion that there's overrepresentation of voices from Western Europe or from certain,
which stems from the outcome of the Second World War, in which Britain and France were at the table and got seats in the
United Nations
Security Council, and others were weakened. I feel that the European Union, where we coordinate our foreign policy, should have an augmented role at the UN.
And is Poland pushing for greater diversification, plurality of voices within the European structure? Because, we have folks like in Hungary, for instance, like the Orban administration has strong opinions about the direction of Europe, and the feeling that his opinions are not...
We're free countries, European integration has not abolished the difference in national interests. The point is to coordinate them by discussion and by votes rather than by traditional means, which were very painful. So we don't begrudge member states having their own opinion, but in the end we need to come to a consensus. And Hungary has not always been helpful.
Speaking of Poland, how do you cope with disinformation? I mean, for some of us who have been following your domestic politics, including your career and a lot of people, we know that it's a very tempestuous democracy. Populism, right-wing populism, back and forth tensions between civil society and state. This has been the story of Poland while having this economic miracle you're experiencing. How do you cope? How do you make sure you have that internal coherence as a state, especially with disinformation from Russia and other quarters?
Well, we have a lively democracy, and which is pretty polarized and a variety of views. Disinformation has always been with us. It's just that the technical means of spreading it have become so powerful. And every means of communication, books, newspapers, radio, TV, eventually got regulated, because eventually bad actors misuse them.
Right.
And the internet and social media have recently been misused, and self-regulation has not entirely worked. Quality control at some of these social media are not good enough, and too much falsehood is being spread around. Too many children are mentally affected by these technologies, and therefore we have the right to regulate.
Within a democratic framework, I suppose. Of course. And you think that balance could be struck within a democratic society?
We've already started it. The owner of one of social medium was recently arrested.
The Telegram,
France. But there are other problems. The European Commission has been addressing Mr. Musk. He doesn't seem to be responding. While the quality of Twitter, as far as I'm concerned, I'm a big fan, but the quality of it has recently dropped. When you make so much money from a medium and from a business model that encourages grabbing your attention and even polarizing you,
Right.
you also have some responsibilities. And if they don't take these responsibilities voluntarily, we'll make them.
I find that interesting. I mean, you were a victim yourself, or they tried to victimize you with disinformation and even deepfake. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Yeah.
Well, I was targeted by Fancy Bears, the Russian semi-private, semi-official internet trolling and cyber attack organization. And I've also been attacked by, but I'm not the only one.
Yeah.
Remember, David Cameron was attacked
Right.
by a deep fake. They're trying these things. It's rather childish, but we should be aware of it.
Now, transitioning to Asia, the latter part of our conversation, why is Poland paying more attention to this part of the world? Why are you here? Because the sense I get is from Europe, some would say, they see Taiwan as a potential parallel to Ukraine. They see China's rhetoric on a new international order, kind of similar to what Russia is saying, not to mention the nexus between those two revisionist superpowers. What is Poland's theory of the case here?
Well, Poland and the Philippines are both aspiring nations,
Right.
growing fast. We are both countries with a Catholic heritage.
Right.
And we are both good allies of the United States that live in a neighborhood that's become less stable of late, with more powerful neighbors who are not quite happy with what they have and the borders they have. That I think produces an understanding between us, and we should look more intensely at how we can help each other.
And speaking of Philippines and Poland, what are the areas that you think we have to strengthen our relationship? You are a big provider of Black Hawk helicopters. Your defense industry is increasingly world class, and you're having a lot of interface with South Koreans, for instance, and other Asian countries. Where do you want the Philippines and Poland to go?
Well, my delegation has included Deputy Defense Minister, Deputy Cyber IT Digitalization Minister, and the Deputy Agriculture Minister. I think that gives you an idea of which we think are the promising areas.
And what are the areas moving forward you think the two countries should focus on, I think, in terms of people to people and cultural? There's a lot we have in common, but we have to discover that, yeah.
Polish tourists are adventurous, and I hope they discover Philippines. We are very glad to have your pilgrims
Yes.
to Poland's
Right.
Catholic holy sites.
Right.
We think we also offer EU-respected education at a reasonable price. I hope your students take advantage of that. There really is plenty that we need to discover about each other.
On that positive, inspirational note, thank you very much,
Thank you, my pleasure.
for that fantastic conversation. We live in interesting times. I think if you look at our conversation with Foreign Minister Sikorski, it's very clear that Asia and Europe are meeting each other in ways that not many people anticipated not long ago. There's a lot of nexus, there's a lot of connection between these two parts of the world. At the very fundamental level, of course, the understanding in Europe is that what happens in Ukraine is going to have a bearing on China's calculus in this part of the world. In particular, from my understanding in conversation with a number of European leaders, it looks like they think that what happens in Ukraine will affect China's willingness or China's confidence to invade Taiwan. In fact, Taiwan also in recent years has embraced that kind of narrative and saying they are potentially the Ukraine of Asia, and that can go both ways. There's this sense in Europe that what's happening in Ukraine is affecting also China's calculus in our part of the world. So how Ukraine performs against Russia, which by the way has weapon systems that are very similar to that of China thanks to reverse engineering, among other things. There's a sense that if Ukraine successfully continues to bog down Russia and ward off Russia and protect its sanctimony and sovereignty, then Taiwan will be inspired. Then China will think twice. And of course, from an operational logistical standpoint, invasion of Ukraine was much easier for Russia because it's a ground warfare. It's a ground invasion compared to what China will have to do, which will be far, far, far more complicated. And not to mention, Taiwan is a far more formidable country in terms of resources, in terms of technology, and increasingly assistance from a lot of neighboring countries, including the Philippines. So in the same way that Poland is just right next in line, the sense that if Ukraine falls, then Poland could be next. I think a lot of us in the Philippines can also relate to this, because if Taiwan is the Ukraine of Asia, and if Taiwan falls, then Philippines could be next, or at the very least, Philippines will be immediately the neighbor of China, and that will come with all sorts of different strategic nightmares, especially because we have a lot of bases, including ETCA bases with Americans in the northern provinces of the Philippines. That's one nexus where Asia and Europe are coming together. And there's this understanding that conversations about Russian revisionism should be echoed, or at least finds echoes in conversations with Chinese revisionism in our part of the world. And to cap it all, Russia and China have moved closer in ways that I think many experts did not anticipate. I mean, the reality is that Russia and China have been competitors for a very long time. In imperial period, actually, China saw Russia as a source of threat. And then, of course, during the Cold War period, especially after the death of Stalin, there were moments of almost complete, march towards warfare between Maoist China and Khrushchev's Soviet Union. You had the Sino-Soviet split. You had competition with Soviet Union and China. And not to mention, of course, after the end of Cold War, there were a lot of concerns about whether, Russia or post-Soviet Russia would risk its technological integrity and supremacy if it allowed China to essentially pirate them, right? And there was this fear that Russia is vulnerable because it has a huge border with China, and these borders in the Siberian regions are very resource rich, but Russia actually doesn't have much of a population in that area. So from my own conversation with Russian analysts and strategists back in the day before the whole Ukraine conflict really got out of control, they would say that actually they're also concerned about China and the threat that they feel from China in the Siberian region. So going back to this, China and Russia right now are moving closer in ways that not many people anticipated. And part of that is, of course, this shared sense of dread and threat they feel from the West, legitimately or otherwise. Also, this sense of destiny, especially in the part of Xi Jinping, who feels that it's time for China to reclaim its place of pride on the global map. In the case of Putin, that's more a question of grievance, trying to reclaim Russian greatness. And after all, this is a person who said that the fall of the Soviet Union was the greatest tragedy of the 20th century. So there's clearly that Homo Sovieticus and that kind of Russian imperial mindset at play there. And now you have Xi Jinping and Putin, more or less the same age, more or less cohorts. And in the case of Xi Jinping, someone who's very familiar with Russian culture and literature and history, both of them coming together and saying, we have to really work this through. Otherwise, the West is going to undercut us. And in the case of China, they're also worried, of course, about whether they can sustain their rise. So that's where Philippines and Poland come into picture, because Philippines and Poland, both of them are plucky middle powers who are exercising strategic agencies. They're two vibrant and polarized democracies in many ways who are facing disinformation coming from these revisionist powers. And these are two countries who are not willing to succumb to this narrative that they're just proxies of the West. They're trying to exercise their own strategic agency. And more importantly, these are two non-Western countries who are actually invested in the existing international rules-based order. The narrative from Kremlin or from Beijing and their friends in this part of the world is that the rules-based international order is neither rules-based nor really international. Not rules-based because the West, including America, has taken exemptions to international law, has invaded Afghanistan and Iraq, has made a lot of mess around the world, and it's not very international because it's really Western. I think that's where Philippines and Poland become important voices, because even though both of us are non-Western countries, we do believe in a rules-based international order that is not necessarily Western or American, but actually reflects the interests of smaller countries. We want an international system that is based on the rule of law, including, in the case of the Philippines, the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea, which should be the basis for management and resolution of the disputes in the South China Sea. So that's one area where the two countries come together. Now, obviously, in historical terms, there's also a lot that brings Poland and Philippines together, and that's this shared centuries of historical trauma, right? So in the case of Poland, in the 19th century, they were the vector of anti-colonialism in Europe. In the Philippines, we were the site of first anti-colonial struggle in Asia. Poland's case was really tragic because at least on two, if not three occasions, they almost completely disappeared from the map as different empires devoured them. In the case of the Philippines, just as we were winning our independence from the Espanol, the Americans come in and steal the show, and we end up as an American colony, and the rest is history. And then, of course, there's a trauma of early 20th century when Warsaw and Manila were two of the three or four most devastated cities on earth. And so the 20th century was really traumatic for both of our countries, but the 21st century is ending up as a century of opportunity, of self-assuredness and self-confidence, and also a lot of geopolitical uncertainty. And I think that cocktail is precisely what's pushing both Poland and the Philippines to play a more important role on the international level, but also for us to come and interact more with each other. So, as I mentioned earlier, in Europe, the conversation already is Ukraine, Taiwan. What happens in Ukraine will affect what China does vis-a-vis Taiwan. Of course, in the Philippines, though, we have also stood strongly with Ukraine based on international law. The idea that you cannot just go and invade another country based on some nonsensical claims, right? Or some mumbo-jumbo narratives about history, right? So we are probably the only Southeast Asian country who has consistently stood by Ukraine, but we also have shared values. But more importantly, in the case of the Philippines, not so different from Poland, we also see ourselves as a middle power which can actually shape international system, shape our regional environment. And along those lines, the Philippines is proactively developing a strategic relationship with a great number of new powers and like-minded countries, and Poland is one of them. So despite huge differences between the Duterte and Marcos and even Aquino administration, the continuity we see here is that the Philippines has to build up its capabilities, has to modernize its armed forces. And one country that has been very central to the modernization of the armed forces of the Philippines is actually Poland. We got a lot of Black Hawk helicopters from Poland, and Poland actually could also be a role model for the Philippines in terms of developing our own defense industry. And there's so much more. So when the Polish high-level delegation visited the Philippines recently, they brought with them folks from different sectors, as the foreign minister mentioned a while ago in our interview. So you were talking about cybersecurity, agriculture, you were talking about digital economy, and you were talking about defense industry. So there's so much that we can do there. But I think we can also have more and more diplomatic cooperation, diplomatic coordination in terms of making sure at the international level we become the voices of rules-based order. So that it's not just Western countries or Japan. We have to be part of that conversation together with the more non-aligned countries like New Zealand or India, or to a certain degree even South Korea, which despite its alliance with the United States has tried to position itself in an equally balanced relationship towards both US and China in light of the concerns that it has in North Korea. So going back to this, there's a lot that brings, I think, Poland and the Philippines together. And I think this is a relationship, it's a budding relationship that also tells you about the nexus. As a Polish diplomat interestingly say, only two countries separate Poland and the Philippines, which are separated by thousands and thousands of miles: Russia and China. And China is not even supposed to be our neighbor. They only became our neighbor because they're claiming the West Philippines. They're claiming our exclusive economic zone because they're claiming way beyond what is accorded to them based on international law and UNCLOS. Because if you look at the facts, Hainan is actually their southernmost province, but they're making it as if Panatag Shoal or Ayungin Shoal is their southernmost territory. So this is the context within which these conversations are happening. And I think our growing cooperation with Poland just tells also something about our growing strategic maturation as a rising middle power. That we're not just looking at the US, we're not just looking at the number of big powers, we're not just looking at France or UK, which are important powers, but we're looking also at rising middle powers. And perhaps there are things that we can also learn from these countries. So thank you very much again for everyone who listened to our interesting conversation here. And we're going to have more of this monologue and analysis soon. Catch us again next week here on One News. You can also check out the long conversation on Spotify, YouTube, and Google Podcasts. I'm Richard Hidarian, and that was a view from Manila. We're One News, all sides, all the time.